For most Utahns, the annual fireworks extravaganza at Salt Lake Sugar House Park is of great significance. It is not, however, a 4th of July celebration. It's a 24th of July celebration, marking events both joyous and poignant of special importance to Utah's Mormons. For many, the fireworks commemorate more than just entry into the Salt Lake Valley. Let me explain. This pleasant place was once the site of Utah's territorial prison, completed in 1854. Paradoxically, it came to symbolize, to some early Utahns, liberation from federal efforts to stamp out Mormon distinctiveness. There were 47 inmates here in 1880, only 7 of them native sons. But shortly thereafter, the prison population began to boom. It had reached 60 by 1884 and continued to grow so fast that they had to build a new building just 4 years later. That new building was already too small to house the burgeoning population when it was completed in 1888, so another was constructed 3 years later. Among the prisoners were members of the Mormon First Presidency, apostles, and dozens of stake presidents and bishops. All were imprisoned as they saw it, not for any harm or offense done to others, but because in their marriage patterns they chose to differ from mainstream America.
On Friday fish, on Sunday beans, the bread is fit for kings and queens. All you lack is cabbage and greens when you get into limbo. They'll shave your face and mow your hair and give you striped clothes to wear and see that you have the best of care when you get into limbo.
Thus, the flood of new inmates of the late 1880s may have been the most unique prison population in the history of penology. One of them, James Bywater, wrote, after being assigned to his cell,
Brother Harper was my cellmate, and we decided to keep our cell pure and free from pollution. So in the evening, we arranged that we would dedicate our cell for our home and unto the Lord.
Release from prison was often a cause for public celebration. A federal official complained bitterly.
Some, having served their time, have been met at the prison doors by brass bands in a procession with banners, escorted to their homes to be toasted, extolled, and feasted as though it were the conclusion of some brilliant and honorable achievement, rather than an expiation for a crime committed against the laws of the country.
Hard words. But these were hard times for Utah's Mormons. And though most of them were born in America, their critics considered them decidedly un-American. By 1885, the Mormons and the American people had reached an impasse. The Civil War had ended. The reconstruction of the South was completed. Congress, accustomed to unrestrained power in the conquered provinces of the South, now turned its full attention to finding a solution to what was called the Mormon problem. Congressional interest in the Mormon problem went back at least as far as the 1850s. In 1856, the new Republican Party promised in the presidential campaign to stamp out the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. They lost. The newly elected Democratic president, though soft on slavery, didn't want the nation to think he was soft on both relics of barbarism. He authorized the Utah Expedition in 1857 to assert federal authority in the territory. The Republicans, for their part, passed the first federal anti-polygamy law, the Morrill Act, shortly after they gained power in 1860. However, President Lincoln, with the Southern Rebellion on his hands, had little interest in enforcing it. He explained that as a boy on the farm, they sometimes came upon a log which was too hard to split, too wet to burn, and too heavy to move, so we plowed around it. That's what I intend to do with the Mormons. And that was pretty much what he did. Congress might also have looked the other way, but two groups in Utah were determined to keep the question alive. The first was a rapidly growing community of Gentile businessmen and federal office holders. Because they were a tiny minority in Utah, their main source of power was their excellent connections with Washington. This would be helpful only as long as Utah remained a territory. They therefore vigorously opposed statehood, reminding Washington officials on every possible occasion of the un-American Mormon practices of cooperative economic development, consensus politics, and polygamy. The second lobby important in influencing congressional policy toward Utah was that of the evangelical churches. They saw Mormonism as a heresy, at least as pagan as the Buddhism or Shintoism they were combating in the Far East, and perhaps more destructive because it claimed to be a Christian religion. Indeed, their perception of the Mormons as somehow akin to the Orientals didn't stop there. The hierarchical system of Mormon church government they saw as similar to Oriental despotism. The practice of polygamy was confirming evidence that Mormonism was a bizarre Oriental mutant, somehow transplanted to the desert places of America, but wholly incompatible with American religious and political institutions. The tactics of these two groups were effective. 6 times between 1849 and 1887, the Mormon-controlled territorial legislature petitioned Congress for statehood, and each time the petition was rejected. Utahns watched helplessly for almost half a century as other Western states were settled, given territorial status, and then statehood, often taking territory that had been part of Utah. Frequently, the new neighboring states were not nearly as populous as Utah at the time of statehood. Expressing a view that both the business and Protestant missionary groups could subscribe to was Senator George F. Edmunds in an 1882 Harper's Magazine.
It is the object of the Mormons to set up and maintain an exclusive political domination in the territory of Utah. The problem must now or in the near future be solved, and the irrepressible conflict between polygamous Mormonism and the rest of the United States must have a decided issue.
Well, what about these charges? Was there any truth to them, or were they just the pure inventions of critics who were trying to destroy Mormonism? Though grossly exaggerated in most cases, there was a germ of truth underlying them. In some respects, these hostile critics understood the saints better than they understood themselves. The church government was hierarchical, ascending through priesthood offices to the quorum of the 12 and the first presidency, with the prophet or president over all. One could be given a higher office only at the initiative of those holding that office. The Mormons believed in consensus government. For example, in the 1870s, a problem arose in Mount Carmel, Utah, over economic issues. The question was first discussed at length with the rank and file. But when a vote was taken, it was expected to be unanimous, and all who thus voted were thereby bound to support the policy, even if they had misgivings. In this case, the vote was not unanimous, and the only solution was for the dissidents to pull away and form their own town, Orderville. Only then could the two groups continue to function. There was no room in the Mormon system for a loyal opposition. When Mormons set up civil government in early Utah, they simply nominated those whose aptitude they felt had already been sanctioned by divine call to church positions, normally one candidate for each office, and then elected them. Moreover, as the elected officials met in legislative or other bodies, their decision process often followed that practiced in church councils. Indeed, they made little distinction between religious and secular aspects of their lives. A dispute over water brought before a county court in Taylorsville in 1855 was referred by that court to a church high council. When you compare this procedure to the American political process at the time, you can only conclude that it was utterly alien to the American way of doing things. Politics in the America of the time was a wild and raucous affair, with the most virulent of charges and countercharges being exchanged between candidates. A great hoopla of bans, posters, speeches, and promises was thought essential to the process. Never did the election of one party lead, as Jefferson had hoped, to the end of party and faction. The losers always began shortly to make plans for their ultimate triumph. The political process was just one aspect of the Mormon question. Equally important was the question of what the end of politics was to be. The Mormons expected that one day all civil government would fail, and when that happened, their own church government, which they called the Kingdom of God, would be ready to step in and fill the void. They felt that the Civil War in America would lead to the collapse of the American government, and they made preparations to govern themselves. In 1862, they drafted a constitution for a proposed state of Deseret, elected a full slate of candidates, and petitioned Congress for statehood. When the petition was rejected, the state of Deseret continued to meet until 1870, reenacting each year the legislation just passed by the territorial legislature. In addition, the Council of the 50, a clandestine body of notables, met at various times during the period. This fed rumors that the territory was actually ruled by a small group responsive to church leaders rather than by elected officials responsible to the voting public. In fact, the Council of the 50 did not wield a powerful influence in the mid-1800s. But if I had been a Gentile living in Utah at the time, I just might have felt that my interests weren't being represented in the territorial legislature in a democratic fashion, and that some action was needed in order to bring democracy to Utah. What about the charge that the Mormons were un-American in their economic activities? It is important to remember that this was what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age in America, when John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were heroes, and when Horatio Alger in countless popular stories taught that with a little luck and pluck, the poorest bootblack could, in America, become a millionaire. It was also the age when most people believed that the government should have no voice in economic decision-making, leaving the economy solely to the vagaries of the marketplace and the unhampered decisions of investors and industrialists. Contrast this, if you will, with the central direction given to Utah's economy through Mormon church leadership. The cooperative principles they taught were part of the founding of the ZCMI system, the United Order, and later Zion's Board of Trade, which regulated prices and wages. Their fundamental proposition was that all property belongs ultimately to God. Men may use it and the fruits thereof, but not without entailing certain obligations with such use. Cooperation and sharing were ultimately more ethical than the competition and individualism which are central tenets of capitalism. These principles of economics were noted by non-Mormons at the time. Prominent reformers pointed to the cooperative industries of the Mormons as models for the greater society. The writer Edward Bellamy is reported to have spent time in Brigham City observing its economy and discussing it with Lorenzo Snow before writing his critique of American society, Looking Backward. So, from the point of view of the Gentile capitalist in Utah, the Mormon system, I suspect, would have looked quite un-American. Recognizing all these differences, those that opposed the Mormon Church nonetheless agreed that their most valuable asset in their effort to Americanize Utah was the polygamy question. Polygamy had been introduced secretly by Joseph Smith in the early 1840s and had been controversial and divisive, even among Smith's inner circle of loyal followers from the beginning. The revelation commanding the practice was written down in 1843. The practice was publicly announced and defended in 1852, shocking and outraging the sensibilities of middle-class Victorian America.
Well, come, girls, come, listen to my noise. Don't you marry the Mormon boys. 'Cause if you do, your fortune it'll be Johnny cakes and babies is all you'll see.
Though it was to be limited to men of upright character and reasonable means who could get the permission of the earlier wife or wives, polygamy was more widespread than has often been thought. Recent studies make it clear that at any given time, more than 25% of the men, women, and children were in polygamous households, and nearly 50% of the men in Utah in 1850 took a plural wife sometime in their lives. Most of those who did not were nonetheless committed to the broader system of which it was a part and helped to defend it. The Gentiles of Utah saw polygamy as a moral issue, like slavery, which could be used to unite the American people against the Mormons. They spared no effort to publicize the problems it created and to enlist the help of the nation in eliminating it. Their efforts led to a renewal of national interest in the problem in the early 1870s. An extremely strong anti-polygamy bill was introduced in Congress in 1870, the Cullum Bill. Debate on the bill raised a storm of protest in Utah. Some 3,000 Mormon women held a mass meeting in the Tabernacle, shocking suffragettes around the nation by defending their right to practice polygamy in the name of women's rights. The bill was ultimately defeated, partly because of the opposition of the railroad lobby and of Southern congressmen who did not favor excessive federal involvement in local affairs. Most of its provisions, however, were to be passed as part of subsequent anti-polygamy statutes. The first of these was the Poland Act of 1874. Federal judges had found it almost impossible to get a conviction against polygamists in the probate courts, which were under locally elected judges. The Poland Act moved jurisdiction in criminal cases from the probate courts to the federal courts, thus opening the way for vigorous prosecution of the law. In the meantime, the Mormons protested all such action, claiming that the anti-polygamy laws interfered with their First Amendment rights of freedom of religion. Finally, in 1879, they managed to bring a case before the Supreme Court. The court held that George F. Reynolds, once Brigham Young's secretary, had been rightfully convicted under the Morrill Act. Congress, it claimed, could not regulate religious belief, but could regulate religious practice. With momentum thus established, and with the full support of President Ulysses S. Grant, who had visited Utah in 1875, the campaign continued. The next step was the Edmunds Act of 1882, which was designed to strengthen the Morrill Act. It declared the contracting of polygamous marriages a felony, and cohabitation or living with polygamous wives a misdemeanor. Sentences could range from $300 and 6 months in prison for cohabitation to $500 and 5 years for polygamy. The act denied polygamists the right to vote, hold office, or serve on a jury. Regular election procedures were eliminated, and an election commission was to be established to oversee politics in Utah. The Utah Commission, as it came to be known, arrived in 1882 and immediately began applying the law as broadly interpreted by them and the federal judges. Under the vigorous leadership of Chief Justice Charles S. Zane, the whole federal apparatus was committed to the task of rooting out polygamy and destroying Mormon political influence in the territory. Posters announced substantial rewards for information leading to the arrest of prominent Mormons, and $12 to $20 for the arrest of any polygamist. Zane dispatched federal marshals to all parts of the territory, sometimes disguised as itinerant peddlers or laborers, to try to track down the offending parties.
Now you cohabs still dodging round, you'd better keep on underground, for if with number 2 you're found, they'll put you into limbo. And if you do not fall in line, they'll put you into 59 and take away your topper time when you get into limbo.
On March 31st, 1885, Mormon Church President John Taylor gave his last public sermon, then went into hiding. Until his death, 2.5 years later, he was forced to move regularly from place to place. He dared not visit his wives and families and could meet only occasionally with other leaders. This beautifully concealed trapdoor is in an old polygamous home. Whenever the federal marshals came to town, the father of the family, Edward Patterson, could hide in here until after the marshal had left. The Mormons worked out an elaborate system of surveillance and underground transportation. They built hiding places in barns and cellars as well as in attics like this one, communicating with prearranged signs and codes. Many of them moved to Mexico or to Canada. There they established important colonies under a gentleman's agreement with local authorities who said that they would wink at Mormon polygamy in spite of local anti-bigamy laws. Even with all these precautions, over 1,000 men were arrested and put in prison, swelling the population of the territorial penitentiary at Sugar House. With such a high proportion of the leading Mormon men on the underground, many church programs were temporarily dropped, and the United Order movement was abandoned. Still, the church somehow continued to function, and the People's Party maintained its political control. Some of the Gentiles began to wonder if all this zeal had not been misplaced. Editors of the Springfield, Massachusetts Union expressed the opinion of many.
Not polygamy, but the power of the priesthood is the real danger. The essential principle of Mormonism is not polygamy at all, but the ambition of an ecclesiastical hierarchy to wield sovereignty, to rule the souls and lives of its subjects with absolute authority, unrestrained by any civil power.
Responding to such sentiments in 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, designed to destroy the Mormon Church economically and politically. It abolished women's suffrage in the territory and authorized the Utah Commission to administer to all prospective jurors, office holders, or voters an oath that they did not believe in or practice polygamy. It disbanded the Perpetual Emigrating Fund Company, which commissioners felt brought ignorant aliens directly into the Mormon system without them ever having the opportunity to learn American principles of government. The act removed the remaining obstacles to prosecution of polygamists by requiring compulsory attendance of witnesses at trials and permitting wives to testify against their husbands. Finally, it disincorporated the church and declared that all its property in excess of $50,000 would be taken by the United States. Realizing that full enforcement of this law would bring the church to its knees, the new church president, Wilford Woodruff, encouraged legislators to submit one more petition for statehood. The proposed constitution outlawed polygamy and union of church and state, or domination of the state by any one church. The petition was ultimately denied. The Utah Commission proceeded to require the test oath for all elections and redraw voting districts to lessen Mormon influence. They also appointed non-Mormons almost exclusively as registrars and judges of election. Furthermore, they recommended that Congress pass legislation barring Mormons from voting whether they practiced or believed in polygamy or not. Such legislation had already been passed in Idaho and was sustained by the United States Supreme Court in February 1890. That same month, local elections brought a victory to the Liberal Party in Salt Lake City and in Ogden. Spurred on by the cheering news, Congress proceeded to draft the Cullum-Strubble Bill, which, as one judge put it, stripped of its serpentine verbiage, is simply a bill to disfranchise all members of the Mormon Church. While Congress proceeded to consider the Cullum-Strubble Bill and federal agents began to take over church properties, the church president, Wilford Woodruff, considered his options. Finally, on September 25th, he wrote in his diary,
"I have arrived at a point where I am under the necessity of acting for the temporal salvation of the church. The United States government has taken a stand and passed laws to destroy the Latter-day Saints on the subject of polygamy, the patriarchal order of marriage. And after praying to the Lord and feeling inspired, I have issued the following proclamation, which is sustained by my counselors and the 12 apostles."
In the proclamation, which came to be known as the Manifesto, the church president maintained that no plural marriages had been contracted in Utah during the last year and advised Latter-day Saints to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the laws of the land. Church policy vacillated on the matter until 1904, but it was at least the beginning of the end for the bitterness and anguish the troubles of the last decade had brought. The next year, the church encouraged the founding of the Republican Party in Utah, asking the democratically inclined church membership to support the new party. A month later, they disbanded the Mormon People's Party and asked their members to vote for one or the other of the national parties. The Liberal Party, dominated by non-Mormons, feared that if they disbanded, their voting strength would be split between the two national parties. They continued to field candidates until 1893, and then moved en masse to the Republican Party, which they found to their discomfort already dominated by a number of prominent Mormons. In 1893 and 1894, Presidents Benjamin Harris and Grover Cleveland granted amnesty and pardon to all who had refrained from cohabitation since November 1st, 1890. That same year, Congress voted to restore church property seized by the government. The next summer, they passed Utah's Enabling Act, providing for election of delegates to a constitutional convention. The most significant debate in the convention was over women's suffrage. a constitution was finally written which gave women the vote, outlawed polygamy, and provided for separation of church and state. On January 4th, 1896, President Cleveland issued the proclamation admitting Utah as the 45th state of the Union. Monday, January 6, 1896 was Inauguration Day for the state of Utah. The joy of the occasion resonated throughout the territory. In remote southern Utah, in the little town of Kanab, an aging widow, Rebecca Howell Mace, wrote of it in her journal.
On the 6th, Monday, the officers of the new state were inaugurated, the day being set apart as a holiday to be remembered as such forever. It was enjoyed to the utmost. Guns were fired at daybreak. 10 o'clock, a procession was formed, led by the band of home guards, followed by citizens, also a juvenile corps or bell brigade. At 2 o'clock, the citizens met in the social hall and partook of a picnic dinner. Then followed speech and song, closing the day with a grand inaugural ball. All enjoyed themselves, and it will be a day long to be remembered by the inhabitants of Kanab, both old and young.
The main ceremonies, of course, were held in the tabernacle on Temple Square. The building was extravagantly decorated for the occasion. Both Mormons and non-Mormons participated in expressions of good feelings and reconciliation. The old territorial secretary conducted the exercises, calling on George Q. Cannon to give the invocation. In attendance were Mormon church officials, including President Wilford Woodruff, military officers from Fort Douglas, and an overflow crowd. The new governor, Heber M. Wells, spoke in his inaugural of the need to heal old wounds. After the Tabernacle Choir sang America, the benediction was given by the Reverend Thomas C. Iliff of the Methodist Church. It would seem that neither party to the conflict, so dramatically abated by this happy occasion, understood the full dimensions of what had happened. The Mormons had rather blithely failed to open the political process in the territory to the new populations coming in. Whether they intended it or not, they had in effect denied some civil rights to the minority group. The response seems excessive, but there were those at the time who felt it was necessary. Under prodding from a few of the 21,000 non-Mormons in Utah, the U.S. Congress felt it necessary to countenance the denial of all civil rights to all of the 120,000 Mormons in Utah. And beyond this, they proceeded to dismantle the most visible symbols of Mormon distinctiveness: polygamy, economic cooperation, and political consensus. The Mormons, they felt, had to be thoroughly Americanized and thus prepared to assume the duties of citizenship in the newest state in the Union. Congress had changed, however, only the visible symbols of Mormon distinctiveness. At the heart of the matter was a persistent cultural difference that neither Mormon nor non-Mormon fully understood. Both sides saw the matter as far more simple than it really was. There's a profound irony in the fact that Utah's first white settlers, who tried to solve their Indian problem by getting the Native Americans to adopt white man's ways, now suffered from outsiders who tried to solve their Mormon problem in the same way. But people adhere with remarkable tenacity to their old ways. I am impressed with the persistence and even the resurgence of tribal traditions among the American Indians in recent years, in spite of centuries of suffering and abuse. And I also strongly suspect that the Mormon accommodation of the 1890s was more apparent than real. It may be that the most important lesson we can take from the Americanization of Utah is that it's futile to try to change societies, or at least their fundamental values, by force. A free society flourishes as we learn to tolerate different lifestyles and is diminished when we suppress them. Hopefully, we have at last begun to learn that our notion of what it is to be an American ought to be broad enough and elastic enough to accommodate people who are different from ourselves.